Welcome back to our velocity-based training series brought to you by GymAware. And today we have Module 9, which is the application of VBT in a rehab space. And quite potentially one of the least utilised spaces when we look at VBT in a lot of the performance settings. And typically, velocity-based training has often been associated with big lifts, like Olympic lifting, squatting, deadlifting, and probably for very good reason, because we're looking to have a comparative load, comparative outcomes, and trying to make sure that we can ascertain some really good performance measures and results from it. But it isn't always doubled up in the rehab space. And what we often see is a rehab mentality of light loads, higher reps, and potentially not chasing the velocity component that we need. Now, when we're working with athletes, when we're working in a high performance setting, we want to make sure that we return them better than what they were, and we want to have some very, very strong exit and entry criteria for each phase of rehab, but most importantly, for their return to sport. Now, when we look at return to sport, it is a highly chaotic environment that is very hard for us to prepare every athlete for every chaotic situation they're going to be involved in. But I can tell you right now, velocity is a huge metric that we can chase to make sure that they are physically ready to withstand the pressures of high-speed movements, but also high-powered movements, where we're also shifting large loads at great speeds as well. If you've watched the previous modules, you'll know how much I've harped on about trying to make sure we can have a really good velocity with a really good load and not just pure speed and not just pure max force. We've talked about that middle a lot. We've talked about the bookends a lot. But what does it actually look like in rehab? And ultimately, it's probably quite simple when we break it down. Because in a rehab setting, we kind of derive a lot of our criteria off two major components. One is any pre-injury data. Now, if you're lucky enough to work with an athlete or a squad of athletes where you can collect numerous data points on them before they actually get injured, that's the gold standard. If we know that they can do a single leg hop for X distance before they're injured, then that's a fantastic criteria for us to use for them to get back to sport, because we know that's where they were at previously. When we look at the use of VBT, we can do the same thing. When we're working GymAware options, we can use all the tests that we went through in our testing and assessment module, but we also can then double down on doing some more unilateral options. We showed a leg press type measurement. We can do single leg press options. We can do split squat or split stance options, in particular, something like a Bulgarian or a single leg Smith machine squat to a box. And we're trying to maximize speed off the box using the GymAware unit and establish some fantastic velocity outcomes for not just performance enhancement when we're doing it with them being healthy, but also we can have a huge repertoire in our bank of what data we can use pre-injury in the chance, and we all know athletes are usually only one day closer to getting injured, that when we do unfortunately go through an injury side of things, hopefully it's always just a small low-grade injury, but if we have a long turnaround, might be an ACL, might be a shoulder, where we can use the pre-injury data, we can create and feed into a really strong objective return criteria for that athlete. And it's not just on volume of reps, not just on loading, but on velocity as well. And velocity is usually one of the quickest things to lose and often the last thing to return to a strong, healthy joint or muscle. So we want to make sure that we have a way to measure it. Using jumps and throws are fantastic, but to have a VBT unit that allows us to identify the key hard metrics to track and to have a almost traffic light system, green, orange, red, of how close these athletes are to return is really powerful. Not just for athlete buy-in, but for coach buy-in as well. When working with a head coach in a team environment, they want to see why their player is not returning to the field, the pitch, the court. And to have hard data to be able to support that is very powerful. Now, if we're not lucky enough to roll a pre-injury option, where we've had these athletes for a while and we've collected some really good velocity data on them, we may look at it from a post-injury position, where when we've got post-injury data, we want to make sure that we're starting to collect data on the injury after the fact. And obviously, if you've done something like an ACL or a hamstring, we can hardly test that side. So we will extrapolate from the opposite side. Now, the weakness with that is some people are just naturally imbalanced. Some people are a little bit slower on the right versus the left. Some people might have a dodgier hamstring on the left or the right, depending on their history. So it's really hard to extrapolate an exact amount, but we certainly can utilize post-injury data using our VBT quite powerfully. Now, as an example, if someone's done an ACL, certainly you're not going to be able to do probably phase 1 of their rehab. But as they start to get back to general movement and can start to execute some really good outcomes on one side, what we can start to do is let's look back at our velocity measurement on a Smith machine, single leg box squat. We can take the VBT unit, test that, get a velocity outcome off that we're going to aim for on the other leg. And we also probably want to assume that the uninjured leg has probably lost a little bit of velocity. So typically for me, I like to always add the arbitrary 10%. So I want to try and have those real exit and entry criteria targets to be really powerful and strong, not just easy ticker boxes. So usually if I'm using post-injury data, I will often have the old rule of 10%, add a little bit of 10%, whether that's adding more load or decreasing speed, but making sure that it's not just this easy ticker box, that we are targeting a really solid criteria. So once we've collected whether it be pre-injury data or post-injury data, or maybe it might be a mixture of both, we may have some bilateral options with our pre-injury and then some more unilateral options with our post-injury. We can start to actually combine the two and create a really strong velocity thread across all of our key phases of rehab that will give us our objective return criteria. Now, we want to have what we would term probably a PB in velocity, or at least really close to it, for our return to play or our return to performance. From that, we can start to extrapolate percentage-based reductions across each phase to try and work out what we want to actually have as our exit criteria for each of those different phases, or if you prefer to use the term entry criteria into the next phase. Here at Athletes Authority, we have 5 key phases that we work from, and 4 of those phases will have velocity-based criteria. So if we're using 100% per se as our return velocity to return to performance, typically taking 20% off each of those in each of those phases can be a really powerful way. Depending on it, if it's an upper body option where maybe the initial phase is a bit quicker than the lower body, you may be able to create more of a 10 or a 5% change in each of those phases. So in a short module, very hard to go through every single injury and what the percentage reductions or changes you might select for each of your phases. But the important takeaway from this module is to understand how we can layer in a velocity thread across each of our phases, have a key entry and exit criteria across each one of them, but also be really specific around what our criteria is for our velocity when we're returning an athlete to performance, and making sure that they're clear on it, coaching staff are clear on it, and you're clear on it to make sure that we can progress them to a position of performance rather than just ticking the boxes for when they return. Beautiful.